You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is May 31st, 2024. I'm here with Professor Chris Coyne, my close colleague here at George Mason University and the Mercatus Center. And Chris has a new book out called How to Run Wars with Abby Hall, and we're here to discuss this new book. So Chris, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Pete. It's always good to talk to you.
And let me just start out with the very first thing to make sure that I ruined the subplot, which is, you wrote a satire. Economists are not really known for their humor very much, right? I mean, there used to be an old joke that God created economists to make accountants look interesting. And so you wrote a satire. What made you decide to write a satire, especially in a field that you have spent the better part of 20 years developing a very detailed research program in?
Yeah, so I'm glad we're starting with this because people see the title of the book, How to Run Wars, and perhaps read some of the blurbs associated with it, and then they might be confused, at least those that kind of know what I've worked on in the past, since it's kind of framed as being quite different, but it is meant to be satirical. And I certainly would have never thought even a few years ago that I would ever do anything like this. I hadn't thought about it, and this is my first time ever writing in this style, and certainly in any kind of sustained way. And it was by chance, actually. And it was kind of a confluence of factors. One is I forget where, I wish I remember the person so I could thank them, but I was taught either speaking somewhere or someone emailed me after listening to some podcast I had done or something. And they said to me, what you're saying sounds like Bruce Winton Knight in a book he wrote long ago called How to Run a War. And I had never heard of Bruce Winton Knight, so I had to go kind of dig into it. And you rarely hear Bruce Winton Knight talked about. And it turns out that Frank Knight, the famous Chicago economist, came from a family of economists. And normally when we say a family of economists, we think about parents or grandparents. In this case, I think there was either 4 or 5 Knight boys, one of those two. 3 of them were professional economists. So Frank Knight, of course, is famous for being at Chicago and the most well-known. But Melvin Knight, the older brother, was at Berkeley, and Bruce Winton Knight was at Dartmouth. He was a professor at Dartmouth. And he had actually done his graduate work in Michigan. So he worked with Fred Taylor, of course, the Fred Taylor of market socialism, Fred Taylor. And then he spent his career at Dartmouth. He wrote, I think, 3 or 4 books, and 1 or 2 of them was the equivalent of what you and I would consider to be a principles book of economics. And one was this book, How to Run a War, which was published in 1930 by a trade publisher. And when I finally got my hands on it and I read it, I was blown away by it. Bruce Winton Knight had served in World War I. So he actually had served in the war. And he wrote this, I think it was published in 1936. So he must have been working on it prior. And it's written as a book that is addressed to kind of the elites of society. And he talks about, very much in the time, of course, that he's writing, what it takes to run a war. And I thought this was just extremely clever as a means of communicating the idea, but also it made me laugh, but almost feel bad about laughing since the subject matter is so serious. So my colleague and frequent co-author, Abby Hall, I was talking to her kind of about our next project, and we decided to write this in short form to see how it worked out. And we thought it went pretty well. So we decided to expand it into a book. And the other influence that was happening at this time was I very much, and I'm still working my way through it, I started to revisit the work of Kenneth Boulding in detail, meaning starting from almost the beginning of his work and working my way through it. And as you know, and I learned about Bolding from you as a graduate student here at George Mason. You had interacted with him as a student. You had incorporated some of his insights into your own work, but I had never systematically worked my way through it. And of course, I have a natural kind of parallel of interest with Bolding with the conflict stuff. But the other thing with Bolding, as you know, is, I mean, he was a true Renaissance man in terms of his knowledge of things, but his stylistically. So he didn't just do technical economics. He wrote sonnets, he wrote ballads, he drew art, he painted art. And it's interesting, actually, and then I'll wrap this part up, but Bruce Winton Knight wrote a ballad. It's called The Ballad of Right Price in 1920 when he's at Michigan. And it's about how a king imposes a price control on bread because he doesn't like how much and he threatens to cut off the ears of the bakers if they and the farmers if they charge above his price. But then later on in the ballad, he goes to dinner and he can't get any bread. So then he gets very angry and sends out a party to go look in the entire land for bread, and he can't find it. And it's a lesson on price controls. But then Bolding in 1950 wrote a follow-up to this, there's a relationship between them. There's an appreciation, I think, of the art of communication, which I very much admire in both these thinkers. And this project can be seen as an effort, hopefully, to work in that spirit, to take a style which, as you put it, is rarely, even outside of economics, satires, you see them here and there, but they're not nearly as frequently used as a style as it was in the past, and to shed light on a really important and sobering topic.
Of course, one of our most well-known pieces in the history of economic communication is Bastiat's satire about rent-seeking. Basically, the candlestick makers petitioning the government for the unfair competition from the sun. The other thing that I want to stress, and it just dawned on me while you were talking, is actually you did have some history in writing satirical pieces all the way back in graduate school when you had a little blog called Games Economists Play. And you would do the absurd. That was more like the circus of the absurdity, but it was still the same kind of thing. You had a lot of fun poking fun at the extreme versions of economists thinking about things. And I like this connection between Bolding and Knight's brother. I do think someone should fact check me on this, but I believe it's the case that Knight's father had made all three of them, all brothers, all five of them or whatever, sign a pledge that they would devote their lives to Christian fellowship. So they all start out studying theology, but they kind of break away from that. But it's also the case, I think, that Frank Knight, the famous one, led his brothers in a rebellion where they all burned their letters in their backyard or whatever, so that they didn't have to, follow through. But Ross Emmett or someone else could maybe fill in on the details if that's true or that's just apocryphal. Okay, so the next question that I wanted to ask you about was that you actually in the book lay out very concrete, practical advice. It fits under a broader umbrella of U.S. exceptionalism. That is the empire of liberty, and so therefore we're excused from any of the bad behavior compared to all the other ones. But you walk through all of them. I'll name some of them here, and then you can fill out. But control the narrative, capture the media, prepare for the sacrifices, violate liberty in the name of liberty, embrace planning, eliminate any fiscal constraint, on the system, silence dissent, ignore international law. And these represent the core chapters in that second part of the book. So can you give any particular examples? But more importantly, what I was going to try to ask you is the interconnectedness of them. So the fact that you have to have the fiscal restraints released in order to be able to achieve the goals that you set on the other one, there's kind of a inevitability from one stage to the next stage to the other stage that I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on.
Yeah, so I think the way I would start to think about this is in these terms. So as you mentioned, just to give context, the book is written as a guidebook or instruction manual to the national security elite. And we use the term national security elite in a very broad sense to capture all of the key decision makers, which of course will vary depending on the context, private, public, the entanglements between them. They're involved in operating the American national security state that is entailed in designing and implementing and carrying out foreign policy. And so that's what the book is set up as. And the instruction, each chapter is kind of a topic that we then kind of lay out why it's important. And while it's satire, we try to provide real world examples and references, of course, to document the claims being made. And so the motivation in the broadest sense is this. Many people talk about foreign policy, talk about conflict and war as if it's a immutable fact of life. And certainly there are aspects that are. Conflict, if we define conflict as a conflict of interest, then certainly any interaction between people is going to, or I guess it doesn't have to, but typically there'll be some conflict of interest that we have to navigate. So conflict is a part of life, domestically, in all different contexts, internationally in all different contexts. So then it's how we're going to deal with it. And what I call kind of the war system, which is the apparatus that's set up to prepare and engage for war, is treated by many as a required and immutable part of life. It has to be that way. And then people focus on specific instances of conflict, usually in the here and now, and war making, and then try to think about the optimal policy. And you hear people talk about this in terms of current events. What should we do about Israel, Hamas, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia? And people want short answers. Tell me what you would do. What should we do? And those are important questions, but also important, we think, Abby and I, is to step back and say, well, wait a second, let's think about the nature of the war system itself as a apparatus, and what is actually required to run this thing? What is required to operate it? And why might that question and then sub questions that come out of that way of framing it, why is that important? Well, I think it's important because if we are going to, number one, say we can do certain things, so accomplish certain ends, we want to think about the means that need to be employed to accomplish them. But even beyond that, if we're going to make some claim about the kind of normative values that we believe in, that we seek to advance, certainly in the American context, what people often refer to as a liberal set of values, then this set of questions is important because one of the things you realize is that in order to attempt to accomplish those liberal ends, if we take that as the given goal, more often than not, along all these different steps of the way to get there, the portfolio of activities that's involved in war making are inherently illiberal. And then we have to ask ourselves some really difficult questions. For instance, at what point do we become the very thing we are trying to push back against and fight against? At what point do our own liberal sensibilities, if not institutions, erode, if not entirely become illiberal in nature, and so on? And so the way Abby and I tried to approach this topic is, let's think what you would need to do to actually win this, to implement a war and win it. Well, you'd have to frame it, because the political elite need the support to varying degrees of the populace. And so in order to do that, you need to frame the narrative. You need to control the information that is provided. You need to frame it in a certain way. You need to selectively emphasize some things and de-emphasize other things, if not keep it altogether secret. You need to engage in threat inflation. So you need to excite the passions of the citizenry by framing things as if there is some existential threat that if you do not allow the national security elite to address, it will somehow lead to severe harms, if not the downfall of society. And so that's one. Where does that lead? Well, to influencing the media. Since the media is one way of communicating with the masses, it's going to naturally lead, this is your point about interconnection, it's typically going to lead to trying to influence the media. And of course, historically, governments were quite explicit about this. During the World Wars, for instance, the American government didn't hide the fact that it invested significant resources in propaganda, in information dissemination, in directly attempting to influence the media to communicate the desired message. And then you continue down. Well, in order to engage in war making, the government needs a lot of resources, both to prepare for war making and then engage in it. Where are those resources going to come from? Well, you got to pull them out of the private sector. So, of course, there's wide ranging economic effects there. But then you also have to think about the incentives facing elected officials, which, of course, goes back to something Adam Smith highlighted, which is political rulers will hesitate to impose new taxes that are readily observable because they anger the populace. And so, as Smith pointed out, there's an incentive. It's not an immutable law. It's not a fact of life that it has to be this way. We have had war taxes in the past, but Smith says the incentive is going to be for political rulers to try to conceal costs. And how are they going to conceal costs? Debt issuance and debasement of the currency, in Smith's telling. And so it throws off the fiscal shackles. It replaces market activity with top-down economic planning because, of course, when you engage in war making, you need to have the production of a lot of resources to carry out the war. That entails war planners imposing a hierarchy of ends on markets, and in doing so, necessarily replacing the diverse hierarchy of ends that are possessed by decentralized ordinary consumers, and so on down the list it goes. And so what we hope, the book's relatively short, and each chapter we tried to purposefully keep it short to make it very accessible. At each point, we're hoping that the reader, at a minimum, steps back and reflects on what war making requires. And think about the exact point you raised earlier, that you can't just do one of these things. They're all interconnected. In many cases, one leads to another. In some cases, they're not directly causally related, but they're part of the broader portfolio of activities. But to reflect upon what that looks like, and then you can start thinking through what the implications are for real world policy from there.
Yeah, I want to just push you a little bit on a couple points just to sort of tease out some of this stuff, because both you and I are very influenced by Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. I consider that still the best presentation in many ways of what the libertarian position is. Maybe Chandran Kukathas's book on the liberal archipelago might be an advance, or Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. But Rothbard certainly is in the top of that. And as you know, in the beginning of that book, he actually tries to make a very strong case for the ideals of the American Revolution, and that there was something special about that. In Lavoie's National Economic Planning, What is Left, he compares and contrasts the Russian Revolution with the American Revolution. And his argument is that the American Revolution, the problem was it was the right revolution, but it didn't go far enough. They were inconsistent, which I'll come back to in a second about your point. Whereas the Russian Revolution is that they went in the very wrong direction. So at some level, there is some kind of argument for American exceptionalism, even in your own work, which is one of the things I want to follow up a little bit on, which is in your book on In Search of Monsters. The whole point there is from that quote from John Quincy Adams, which is that there is this America, which is special, and that we become not special when we go searching for monsters to destroy abroad. So there has to be something that's there. What status do you, because part of your argument and the way you set up the satire is to actually make the claim about American exceptionalism seem absurd, right? There's an absurdity to the claim. Like, China is doing this. Oh, by the way, we're doing this as well, but we're America, so it doesn't count when we do it or whatever. And there is something very, absurd about when you put it so bluntly like that. But is there something also that's unique about the ideas that animated the American Revolution, or the American society, or the ethos, that should be like a priority or preserved? Or is it just, politics levels it all or whatever?
Yeah, well, look, certainly, I'm an American citizen. I've lived here my whole life as my permanent home. I love what America, the country, as Randolph Bourne put it, stands for. He made the distinction between country and state, with country kind of being the animating, broad cultural values that define a society, and the state being the political apparatus that then operates and is the monopoly on force. Of course, people always talk about war is the health of the state. The state actually means something very concrete, because you can despise what the state is doing, but love the features of your country in Bourne's taxonomy of understanding the world. And I very much find that an attractive way of thinking. And so, look, certainly in American history, you see many desirable features in terms of rhetoric, and in some case in terms of actual actions to kind of respect what you and I think would call liberal values, a focus on individual freedom, a focus on human dignity, and a whole host of things associated with that. I won't go into all the details associated with that. But as we know, two things. Historically, you have those ideals, but in practice, we've often failed to live up to them. Of course, there's obvious examples with slavery and so on. But even if you look, you mentioned John Quincy Adams, who, of course, the quote about going abroad in search of monsters is what motivated my last book. But the founders, what we call the founders broadly understood, even among them, there's tensions. So we have discussions of what today might be called a more restrained foreign policy. But, you have Thomas Jefferson talking about an empire for liberty, and you have people talking about westward expansion, and you have people talking about Cuba and so on. And so there's certainly tensions there. And so the way I think about it in my head is, given my own values, given what I find attractive about America as a country, and this is part of the reason I focus on America, because some people say, why don't you focus on all the other illiberal actions, China, Russia, all the other. Well, part of it is, I think, just given America's place in the world, it's important to think about it. But I think focusing on America is important, not because I despise America in any way, but because of those values that I find important. I think it's important to hold America, the country, and the citizenry that constitute America to a higher standard, because those values are so rare in human history, they can be lost very quickly. There's no reason to believe they are permanent features of life. And many people have recognized this, that you need to continue to, as Buchanan put it, reanimate the soul of people for liberty. You need to, as Vincent Ostrom put it, in a very Tocquevillian sense, you need to flex the muscles and develop your muscles of self-governance and liberty. These aren't things we're born with, but rather things we learn and practice and exercise. And so when we make those comparisons, I think they're true. I do think people often in America excuse behavior by reference to exceptionalism. So they'll say, this country did this, we do this, but they're not the same because we're exceptional. And I think that's problematic because for several reasons, but the one I'll highlight now is it normalizes atrocities. It normalizes illiberal behaviors, justifies them. It makes them part of to the extent you represent, the people in a country, in America, represent liberal values, and then you do certain things which are inherently illiberal, but justify them on liberal grounds, it bastardizes the notion of liberalism, at least the way I conceptualize it. And so that's what I want people to realize. It's not that there's a difference in kind on certain margins, but in many instances, on many margins, certainly when it comes to how governments act, these are matters of degree, not kind. And that's not a universal claim, certainly. I don't want to make them sound like they are equivalents in every single way. But in many ways, they are in their actions. And I think that is important to recognize and appreciate, if nothing else, to check our own thinking, to make sure we are upholding liberal values to the extent we care about those things.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. The mental gymnastics that has to go on in order to, justify on liberal grounds the violation of liberal principles in order to maintain liberalism is just, it's mind-boggling actually. So as you know, but not everyone else out there knows, but my brother passed away, 2 years ago now, and he had all this information about my dad that I didn't have, and so and my dad was involved in World War II, and so what's happened is that I never paid attention to any of that before, but I've gone on this deep dive about studying World War II and catching up and reading these books about it and watching these, TV, series or whatever about it. And I was struck because one of the things that's fascinating about it is that there was a certain culturation that fits the thesis of your book that I think people at that time like believed, which is interesting when you read your book because you can have quotes. It's the same thing with the Monsters book. I mean, you can have quotes that go back, 100 years or more in which people are recognizing the tensions that you're talking about. But if you think about even people like, so Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks were the executive producers for these movies like The Band of Brothers or the more recent Masters of the Air. And they're very liberal people, and you would think that they would have wanted to expose the horrors of war, and they do in those shows. They show the sort of as in The Band of Brothers, the unitedness of some sense, but also the sacrifices, like you're talking about. It's like if you look at the Masters of the Air in the beginning, the U.S. Army Air Corps was simply just sending lots of bodies with the idea that you would kill off 80%, but 20% could deliver the bombs. But at some point, the individuals that are involved are also recognizing that they're, bombing Dresden and, wiping out these cities and things like that. And so there's sort of like a kind of a angst that sets in. But then in the series, but then right as you get like an angst about the sacrifice and everything else that's going on, you also then get a entire show, which is why we fought, which is to show them passing and see the Nazi death camps. And then they're like, see, like our cause, no matter what we did that might have been barbaric, our cause was justified because we were saving ourselves from an even bigger barbarian in this regard. So a couple questions that are in there from that statement. I apologize for the ramble. But one, how much effort do you think it takes to acculturate young people into an idea that they would be willing to put themselves on the front line to sacrifice? And this is connected up. Rothbard and others have pointed out about this with public schooling. And a lot of people, as you know, argue that that the draft and public schooling are the two things that we should have to create this common ground. You and I, we disagree with that. But what about that issue of the common, like acculturation into the country that means that you have to sacrifice for the state? I don't know if that makes any sense. But you quote the famous quote from Kennedy, in that where, don't ask what the country can do for you, but ask what you can do for the country kind of idea. How much gymnastics has to be involved in taking young people so that they would, do that?
Yeah, well, first of all, the history is, I like hearing the history of your family, but also the motivation into the conversation, I think, is a very nice segue. So I appreciate it. I on the one hand, it takes perhaps a lot. On the other hand, perhaps not much at all. And I think it depends on the time in history, of course, but governments historically, the American government too, invest significant resources in creating a culture of dependency. And I don't mean dependency in terms of handouts, even though there's that too, or any kind of resource transfers, but a dependency in terms of a loyalty to government. And if you think about it, other countries too. So again, I'm not just, the only reason I'm highlighting America here is because I'm a product of, I was born here and raised here. I know it the best. From a very young age, we are brought up in Pledge of Allegiance every day. And one of my early memories, so I'm like you, I'm of the of the past where a big day in grammar school was when the teacher rolled in the big old TV with strapped to the thing. And we got the basic channels because we didn't have cable in school, and the VCR it was either going to be a documentary or some news event. And I remember the first Gulf War, which would have been 1990. And we had the TV on, and then they handed out yellow ribbons, and we all had to pin them on. And of course, I was a kid. I'm like, what's happening? I was probably happy I wasn't doing math or something like that, or whatever, that was. But, there's a kind of unquestioning attitude. There was no discussion like, hey, why is our government doing this? Why is it sending young people to fight and to put them in harm's way? And I don't think that discussion was lacking just because we were young and perhaps didn't have the intellectual nuance to have it. I think people take things as kind of a given, and times have changed. So what do I mean by that? If you look actually in surveys, now the number of people who respond about patriotism compared to the greatest generation and all that, it's actually fallen. Now, what would it mean if there was a major war and you would have to raise a volunteer army? I imagine it would be much more difficult now, and you might have to reinstill something like the draft. But anyway, in terms of the background conditions, I think it's all around us when you start paying attention to it in movies, in sporting events, in just kind of the pomp and circumstance of various political rituals. The militarism is there, is what I mean by that. To motivate a society, though, to go to war, so that might be the argument for it doesn't take much. Certainly it takes a lot. I mean, remember with the draft, there was draft dodging, but of course there was efforts, of course, to make people that did that appear unpatriotic. And one of the things we talk about in the book is you need to silence dissent. And one of the things we urge the national security elite to do is take all and every measure to squash. We call them the naive peacemongers who just say nice utopian things, but don't understand the brutalities of the world. One of the things that has changed now is because of technological advances, governments don't have to put as many troops in harm's way to engage in foreign conflict. You see this in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not obviously zero. There's still American citizens and troops in danger. But that number has fallen, certainly compared to wars of not too long ago, precisely because of technological advances. And so the question you have to think about and ask yourself is, does the maintenance of a free society require that kind of cultural indoctrination? Some people argue yes. Some people argue in order to have a country, in order to have a nation, you need to have a shared set of general values around the state. And that what you might call patriotism is a part and parcel of that. But of course, the risk with that you run, and I don't know where the line is where you cross it, but the risk you potentially run is that patriotism can become blind adherence to government. And of course, when that happens, it inverts the relationship between the state and the citizen, meaning that the way we normally conceptualize it in terms of a self-governing or free society is that political power runs from the bottom up. So the political elite derive their power from the people. But what war making does, if you look at it historically, it inverts that relationship where citizenry become annoyances that need to be pushed by the wayside. That can be drafting them versus voluntary. You don't have a say. You need to do this by the force of law. It can be surveillance to monitor people. It can be throwing people in prison. It can be controlling content. It can be engaging in propaganda and lying. All of these things are efforts to undermine the power of the citizenry, which is why I say it inverts that relationship. Now, then the hard question, I don't have a good answer to it. I have thoughts on it, but not necessarily a concrete answer or a bright line, is what do you do in these cases where there's some existential threat which poses a true, genuine threat to the foundations of society? But just to say one more thing on that, and we can talk more about it later if you want, the risk of that way of thinking quickly leads you into justifying every and all interventions because of existential threats, which is the rhetoric you hear politicians use. as you put it, talking about those historical instances, your father's experience, certainly in the case of World War II, you could look and say there's these atrocities out there, so we're justifying it. The challenge is, of course, at any point in time, there's various atrocities going on at the world at some point in time. Not to say they're equivalent to what was happening with the Nazis. That's not what I'm trying to say. But at any point in time, you could look out in the world around the globe and identify an atrocity or regimes that don't treat people well to varying degrees. The challenge then is you can justify perpetual war around the globe at any time you want, if that's your criteria. So you need some kind of way to narrow that down and decide what that's going to be, which of course is challenging, but what becomes important. And so what we're trying to ask readers to reflect upon is, given what is involved, what different contexts would you be willing to accept this list of principles and operationalize them? And that's for the reader to reflect on. We don't offer any kind of answer to that, any kind of fixed solution, but that's what we're pushing readers to reflect upon when they walk away from reading the book.
I mean, again, the movie that came out last summer was Oppenheimer, but it's based on an actual real book called American Prometheus, which is about the history of Robert Oppenheimer. And it really, was a reality that he had angst after the dropping of the bomb. But when he expressed that angst to the higher ups, like, for example, Truman, he was, in fact, silenced as a whiner, and who the hell are you to bring this up about how we use the weapon or whatever. And I think that mentality is really part of the issue, I think, with your work that makes it so powerful, is if you actually add up what the real costs of war are. So, and given the probabilities of success, go all the way back to your very first book, right? The probabilities of success are very low. The costs are extremely high. If we actually did a cold calculating cost benefit calculation, we would probably go to war a hell of a lot less times than what we do. So a large part of the war making machine is to hide those costs from us in a variety of ways. So one of the things I think is really powerful about this particular satirical book is that it's all grounded in actual facts. It's not so like Bastiat's satire is grounded in an absurdity. The candlestick makers aren't actually lobbying the government for the unfair competition from the sun. But once you say it, you realize that all the other special pleading is the same kind of thing. This is just taken to its logical absurdity. You're not doing that. You're actually relying on quotes, which are just amazing. I want to give you credit for the research that went into all of that. But they're grounded in actual real statements by real political actors that were decision makers on the ground. And in this sense, I see, and maybe you can talk a little about this, the relationship between, let's say, your Tyranny Comes Home book, which again is grounded in the facts of what happens, of what you call a kind of a boomerang kind of idea, or the Militarization book, which also talks about the role that propaganda plays in all of this, or the the Monsters in Search of Monsters. There's a kind of a logical progression in the argument that you're making that would lead you to then be able to comment empirically about how to run wars, because you've studied war so up close and personal and seen what it takes to actually engage in a war and to suppress the actual cold calculating economics of cost benefit calculation of these activities. Does that make any sense, what I'm asking you to?
Oh, yes, of course. And I certainly think you're right. So there's, if you could do the, as you put it, the cold cost benefit analysis, and we took, the standard kind of value of life that actuaries and government agencies use, and we then thought through the logic of that, you could still justify war based on that, but certainly you would, the bar would be quite high.
Especially if you include the other side.
I was going to say that you have to include then of course what people normally do is exclude foreigners or discount, say they're worth less. But then, that of course, like all cost benefit analysis, is a function of the assumptions of the analyst. Then of course there's the challenge of including these unseen long run consequences. But of course then there's the moral arguments too, the standard challenges that we think about in a whole different set of thought experiments. Is it ethical to kill a person, to one innocent person that we know is innocent, in order to save three people? And in many cases, if you think about it, those are the type of arguments you have to face when you're engaged in war making. We know innocent people are going to die, but the justification is that it's worth it. As we put it in the book, you need to break some eggs to make an omelet. In this case, the eggs are human skulls. And we're trying to get the reader to realize there's real human lives that are at stake. And one of the challenges all of us face, and it gets really hard with war making because we tend to think in terms of our people versus other people. It's very hard to put yourself in other people's shoes. But you have to, even though it's tough. So you have to think about your own family, your friends, your kids, your grandkids, and think to yourself, how would I feel if something happened to them with someone else doing what I'm doing to the other side, to us? Or think about how people felt. You're from the New York City area, New Jersey, New York City. I am. Think about how we felt, along with many other people throughout the country, of course, who weren't even from the area after 9/11. And think about the kind of emotional effect that had on us as Americans, and certainly you and I as people that lived in that area. It had a real effect. And then you got to try to think to yourself, well, how would other people view similar actions? That's tough. And so economics, of course, which is the way we approach these issues, can't answer all those moral questions, but it can help us inform that discussion about what those costs and consequences look like. And so you're certainly right in terms of the flow of all this, the way I see it. So if I had to kind of put these all together, these projects, in some sense, this book would be like a prequel. Like if I had one book I wanted someone to read first, it would be this, because it's short, it's accessible, it's supposed to be engaging and a quick read. It's not supposed to be overly academic, although Abby and I spent a lot of time, as you noted, trying to document all the claims we were making and add references in for both the sources of the quotations, but also further reading for readers who are interested in it. But then if they're interested in any one of the topics, whether it is the ability to export democracy, and what that means, the tension between using illiberal means to export liberal institutions, there's an earlier book on that. If you look at the stuff on controlling the media and propaganda, there's a book on that. If you look on the stuff about sacrificing liberties in order to save liberties, there's a book on that. And so it's all been culminating in this. And this is, there's new material in here, of course, but it's a way of, I hopefully bring that all together to demonstrate to the reader how all these different threads kind of fit together, which makes sense. They're all part of the very complex and nuanced enterprise of war making, which is a massive, widespread phenomena, which I think is why it's so important to study it, both interdisciplinary, but certainly for those who are interested in the type of ideas that you and I are, not just in terms of political philosophy, but in terms of economics, and in terms of thinking about the foundations of a free society of equals. It's really important.
Yeah, I think I wanted to, this idea that you snuck in there, which is this moral projection, our ability to engage in moral projection is, imagine if you're a citizen in, I don't know, in Afghanistan, and you project yourself onto that citizen and what they went through with our shock and awe or whatever, right? Kind of thing. And how little we do that. I hear this is going to sound like an absurd example, but I remember, one of the first times I met Murray Rothbard, it was right around the Olympics that were going on. Now, you and I are big sports fans, right? I became interested in things about the Soviet Union precisely because I was outraged that the Soviet basketball team stole a gold medal from the U.S. basketball team in '72. And so that always was a thing. And Rothbard, this is in '84. Remember, the '80 Summer Olympics had been boycotted because of Soviet aggression. And now we had the '84 Olympics. It was going to be in Los Angeles, and it was like a patriotic fest, right? And we had some amazing performances, Mary Lou Retton and all these different people like that. And Rothbard, I remember he started making fun of it. and he's like telling me that it's like all this like, kind of fascist celebration of nationalism. And so, I was shocked at the time because it like just took me back that Murray, made fun of all of this, right? So, but then in retrospect, you realize it is this kind of display. It's exactly how you describe, the propaganda machine going on at Major League Baseball today or whatever, right? And we do all this stuff, or in the NFL. And so how is it that we cultivate in people this moral ability to project? This is a big part of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, learning how to, not just have proximity. I feel bad for this person because, I can see them suffering, right? And so therefore I have empathy for their case, versus the idea that I'm able to project myself morally through my moral imagination into the shoes of another person and see what they suffer. Do you have, after like going through like and thinking about this in a satirical way, the more positive? Because we see how we can blunt that projection, but how would we cultivate that projection among people so that they could love liberty not for just they're the ones who look like them, but for everyone?
Yeah. So this is a very hard question, and I don't have a answer that perhaps is complete and satisfactory, but I do have some thoughts. And so the way I view this right now is something like this. The macro phenomena that we seek to achieve, if you will, is some baseline shared set of values and respect for other people as human beings. That's a very broad claim and a very thin claim, meaning that we haven't filled in all the content of what that means. So then, like a lot of things, I like to think about the micro foundations of macro phenomena. So that's what we want to achieve. What are the micro foundations? Well, I think like a lot of things in social interactions, it all starts at home, or it all starts in your daily life is what I mean by home. And one of the, if we take seriously at least the Vincent Ostrom type of treatment of Tocqueville, then we need to have and reflect upon settings that allow people to learn those skills and exercise those skills. So that means from a young age, people need to recognize that in other people and be able to empathize and sympathize with other people. And what gives me optimism for this is it already happens. We just take it for granted. If you think about it in a kind of daily setting, we all sympathize and empathize, not just with our closest family and friends, but with strangers to varying degrees in various settings. We feel bad for people. We can understand to varying degrees, of course, where people are coming from, the plight they face, and so on. The reason I say that gives me optimism is it recognizes our ability to do that with people that are not exactly the same as us. Then we have to start thinking about what that means in terms of identity. So this is why things like the nation state, the state, patriotism becomes potentially problematic. On the one hand, these are unifying concepts. I am an American. I know what that means in broad terms. It unifies us. It brings us together. And that might generate some benefits on certain margins. The risk, of course, is when you say, I'm an American, they are Chinese. It's collectivism because you're adding up millions and millions of people into these buckets. They are bad. We are good. That is the language. China is a threat to us. Okay. So then we need to start to move beyond those categories of identity. So this is, what comes to mind here are people like Kenneth Boulding in his book, The Image. What is Boulding's point in The Image? All of us from the youngest of ages have a whole this is my words, not his, a portfolio of images that we rely on. The way we view ourselves in relationship to our parents, to our siblings, then people outside, our classmates, if you will, or people on the playground, various authority figures. We also have an image of how we view ourselves in relation to the state at various levels, government and the relationship between them. And then in international relations, we have an image. And one of the things I really like about Bolding's treatment of that is that those images are partially a function of exogenous forces, what he calls messages, which is information that we get from outside that's shaping us. But ultimately, it is within our control. We have agency to, in Bolding's telling, to influence how we view our relationship with others. That can be more hostile or less hostile. Again, that comports with everyday experience. Someone bumps you when you're walking down the street, you bump shoulders. You could turn around and start screaming at the person, cursing at them, hitting them. Or you both could say, excuse me. That's an object of choice. And of course, when one person reacts a certain way, we have the power to de-escalate or escalate. It also reminds me, of course, of more recent work of Amartya Sen on identity and violence. And one of the things Sen points out is that identity in his telling is a multi-marginal concept. So I could choose to identify myself as being from Bergen County, New Jersey, from being a New York Yankees fan, from being an American, and so on, an economist, and all those things would be accurate in that they're describing various parts of my identity. But Sen's point is what we choose to emphasize in different contexts matters a great deal for our ability to coexist with other human beings. Because when we move, for instance, to just across borders, whether it's New York, New Jersey, or America and Mexico, if I emphasize those differences and that's my defining feature. So if I say I'm an American when I'm interacting with someone from New Jersey and New York, then they're still going to have a shared identity. But if it's I'm a New Yorker and you're New Jersey and we're against each other, then you're going to have more likely to have conflict. And Sen's point is we need to, number one, appreciate this point, but we need to discipline ourselves and then perhaps think about various institutional arrangements that empower people to emphasize those parts of shared identity rather than where margins where identity differs. If we're going to live in a world where and pursue a world where there's less violence as compared to more, that's not utopian, because the argument isn't we can just, snap our fingers and make all of the challenges and conflicts in the world go away. Rather, it's an appreciation, I think, or my reading of all these authors through my own lens, of course, is that it is an appreciation of the possibilities of living together, the possibilities of figuring out ways to associate with other human beings peacefully and what is required of that. Recognizing that is step one. It's not the stopping point. It's the entry point then for further consideration. But that's how I think about that. And I try to emphasize that, obviously, to my kids, to students. So one of the things I have students do is write up it was inspired by Elise Bolding, Kenneth Bolding's wife, she called them peace signals. And she said, we overlook these peace signals in the world because we take peace for granted. We focus on violence because it's observable. It strikes us as these outlier situations. And so one of the things she always emphasized is you have to discipline yourself to look for these peace signals, these instances in daily life, domestically, at home, outside your home, internationally, where human beings of very diverse and different backgrounds are able to navigate conflict situations without resorting to violence. And once we appreciate our ability to do that, we can then start to think about what empowers us to do that and then look for other opportunities to expand upon that.
I think one of the really great things of this book, How to Run Wars, is that you pull back the cover that is, or the veil, right? You pull it back that reveals the mentality that is required to do things. At some level, we just saw Nikki Haley sign a bomb, right? And people rightfully were quite upset about all of that. But in World War II, they signed those bombs all the time, and people thought that was like a good thing or whatever. You're pulling back and seeing that kind of mentality that's required forces us to think about this issue that you just talked about, which is cultures of peace. And I mean, it's a byproduct of revealing it so drastic to us, I think, is that you start to think like, what would be the alternatives? And, the Bouldings laid that out as cultures of peace. Elise Bolting talked about the idea of cultivating a moral imagination rather than having our imaginations constrained. I would say that a large part of what might be our problem today is that we are been constraining a lot of our imaginations about how we can do this. Anyway, one of the things that you're doing to address that is a project called the Peaceableness Project. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that before we wrap up here. I have one other question I'm going to ask you in the end, but I wanted to make sure that we gave you a chance to talk about this peacefulness.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mentioned part of it before in our conversation on Last Answer about the exercise I have students do. But I got this idea, and this. You were here as a student at GMU. I mean, Kenneth and Elise Bolden came together to campus. They spent time in the economics department, but at the public policy school too. And they gave a joint lecture, and I think it's on YouTube still, but you can find also the working paper. It's like the 20-page working paper that they co-authored, and it's up somewhere online through the public policy school at GMU. And they split it. So I think I forget which one goes first, and then halfway through they sit down, the other person stands up, and they had some disagreements. Elise Boulding wasn't crazy about the foundations of the economic way of thinking, for instance, but their shared kind of vision was this emphasis on peace. And she liked this term peaceableness because she didn't like the term peace for the same reason Hayek took issue with the word competition, the way economists used it, which is they both of them thought the usage of the term reflected an end state versus process. So for Hayek, competition's not a noun end state; it's an ongoing activity. For Elise Boulding, peace is not an end state; it's an action, a constantly evolving set of actions that take on a very heterogeneous kind of feel to them because our situations of conflict, as well as each of us individually, are different and diverse. So she said there's no word to capture that action aspect of it, which is why she suggested peaceableness, which is kind of clunky, but it does the job. So she talked about in that talk about how she had her students, she was running a seminar at GMU actually in the public policy school, how she had her students do this. And I remember listening to this and thinking it was just such a great project. So several years ago, I implemented it across my several of my classes, undergraduate, master students. And it's a short project. I ask each of them to write 2 to 4 entries where I think there's 600 to 800 words. It's not a research project. I ask them to look at their own life and to identify examples and instances where people navigated a conflict situation peacefully without resorting to violence. And this can be extremely what we would consider mundane activities. It doesn't have to be ending a world war. It can be a disagreement with a neighbor, a coworker that you had some kind of conflict with, a roommate, a community member, and so on. And I'm trying to get through their head and get them to realize that this stuff is all around us. And this goes back to what you and I were talking about. And once we realize it's all around us, then we realize it's a matter of unleashing that human potential that already exists, and thinking about ways that we can potentially maximize it. So what I did several years ago, I asked the students when they submit them if they are okay with me putting their entries online. Some decline, which is of course their right. Others give me their approval. And for those that do, I've combined these into a single master document, which now I think runs something like 350 pages. So it's grown quite large. And that's the idea behind the project, to cultivate that way of thinking in students interested in not just defense and peace, but also public policy and economics more broadly. And so to think about a whole host of different settings where this applies. So that's the idea behind the project and the inspiration for it. And my hope is that students take that away from it.
Well, I think that, one of the important issues about economics from Adam Smith all the way up to Mises is that economics, the thing that we need to explain, so the explanandum is peaceful social cooperation. And the mechanism by which we explain that, the explains, is some kind of rational choice institutionalism, what you called micro foundations kind of idea. I think that's the great contribution that economics has to offer to this kind of project, in the idea that, so economics is not about conflict per se, right? That's a wrong way to think about it. When you think in terms of positive sum games, what you do is you see economics as a way in which we can work out peaceful social cooperation among diverse and disparate individuals. And so I think that's our core, going all the way back to Adam Smith and carrying forward. And sometimes it just gets lost in the translation, and we have to push back against that. But anyway, your book is brilliant. It is I hope it doesn't get picked up and forgotten that it's a satire, and instead becomes the guidebook, exactly as you say, to the national security elite. You run the risk of that because you're so close to Washington, D.C., and so people might read that and do that. But I think it reflects extremely well your entire research program that you've kind of created. And besides the Peaceableness Project, let's just end on that, asking you to maybe talk about, how you've created now this community of scholars that are really taking seriously, and some of the projects that people are engaged in, not just yourself, but also, several of your recent students that are out there trying to make sense of the senselessness of war.
Yeah. So again, this initiative, which I'll say more about in a moment, is heavily inspired by the people we've been talking about, but of course by your own work too, as it pertains to the mainline tradition, which is very much bound up, of course, in many of the themes we've been talking about. But one of the things that occurred to me a while back, but I finally sat down and acted upon it, is that there weren't a large number of scholars that I was aware of that were coming from the kind of mainline tradition, broadly understood, who are interested and focused on issues of peace and conflict in any kind of systematic way. And I'm fortunate enough to have enough former graduate students to have met wonderful people through our various fellowship programs who are outside of GMU, but who are studying issues related to peace and war and conflict. And so I had the idea of creating a virtual community. It's called the Initiative for the Study of a Stable Peace. The idea of stable peace, of course, comes from Kenneth Boulding. And that community is at a minimum meant to bring together people and hopefully share ideas. We have all virtually. We have reading groups. We have paper seminars. You've given, of course, one of the talks to the group about Kenneth Boulding and his history and his role in these ideas. And I'm trying to create a community to share ideas, but also push this research together. So then what kind of things are people working on? Well, it varies greatly. We have people like Nathan Goodman, who is, of course, our colleague in the Hayek program, but also a member of the initiative. And Nathan has done, since the time I've known him as a graduate student, just wonderful work on immigration and immigration laws, and a focus not on kind of the standard ways economists would think about immigration. Not that they're unimportant, but normally it'd say, well, you have immigration flows and let's look at the effects, whether the economic effects or the cultural effects. Those are important questions. But one of the things that Nathan really focuses on, which I appreciate, is that when you have laws about immigration, you need to have an apparatus to enforce them. And that apparatus to enforce them requires, very much as you and I have been talking about over the last hour or so, various forms of social control and force. And so Nathan has spent a lot of time in his research program studying what those look like and what the implications are, both domestically for American citizens, but also for foreigners, and more broadly, how those things change or can change the nature of government and government policies. And so again, as we think about, to go back as you put it well before, the general costs and benefits of policies, there's always the scene, there's the observable outlays we spend on policies, but there's these often overlooked costs that are not always so evident. And one of our role as economists is to bring them to the forefront. And that's one of the things Nathan has done. What are some other examples? Chandler Riley, who's a professor now at Metro State Denver. His research looks at the military-industrial complex and how it affects university research centers and the study of various topics related to research and development. There's people like Nathaniel Smith, who's at Sweetbriar. He's focused on issues of international trade and capitalist peace. Jordan Lofthouse, who's our colleague here at Hayek, who came through our PhD program. A lot of his research focuses on environmental issues. And one of the things he's focused on, among others, under this banner of environmental scholarship is the effects of war and conflict on the environment. And then, of course, Michaela Novak, who's another one of our wonderful colleagues here at the Hayek program, she's very much focused on a host of topics related to this. Things like social movements and how they can generate social change peacefully, but also the very nature of peace itself, this idea of what she calls peace entrepreneurship, and how people can bring about resolutions to conflicts peacefully because there are great gains to doing so. As you put it earlier, there are positive sum gains. And I don't mean these narrowly in the economic sense of money, even though those exist as well, but living together peacefully. I mean, violence is one of the worst things human beings can do to each other in terms of the costs it imposes. So then when people can come up with creative ways of avoiding those situations, the benefits are significant. And so I very much value the work she has done, but also what she is thinking about to push that research forward. There's many others as well. The website for that is stablepeace.com if anyone's interested. And there's more details about the initiative and the various scholars who are part of that network and what they're working on.
I think that this work that you're doing, Chris, is foundational, and I think that there's right now there's a lot of interest among a lot of traditional people in economics and political science about the nature of development economics and the issue of overcoming the violence trap. So Barry Weingast is working on a whole book on Adam Smith as a political economist, where he's focused on that aspect of Smith. There's work by Acemoglu and others who will also talk about this issue. Of course, a lot of the issues of the state capacity, but they get caught in these issues of the mental gymnastics of it all. Whereas instead of seeing it as the society can actually have these peace entrepreneurs, that civil society can rise up and solve these problems, and that civil society can in fact be the foundation of what Kant hoped for, which is perpetual peace. I think this is a major research project, and I'm so thrilled that you're engaged in it. Anyway, How to Run Wars, brilliant book, absolutely brilliant. It should be right there next to Bastiat's petition of the candlestick makers, petition from the candlestick makers to the government against the unfair competition from the sun. It's a wonderful read, as you said, and it's grounded not in the absurdity, but actually in the reality that is absurd in and of itself. So I want to congratulate you on this wonderful book, and I hope it gets a very, very wide audience.
Well, thank you, P. I appreciate the kind words and for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.